Welcome to the Community Development Podcast, a podcast dedicated to community development practice and approaches, sharing our learning and connecting the workforce. My name is Russell. Welcome to episode 55 of the Community Development Podcast. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. The last episode we put out a couple of months ago, a flurry of episodes, and there'd been a little bit of a break. But episode 54 was a chat that I recorded that was opening the Modern Cockney Festival, an online and in-person hybrid festival in East London that tries to explore and unpick and bring into a bit more of a current and contemporary era Cockney identity in East London and what it means to be working class across different races in that part of the world. Fascinating talk. It was with Professor Joan C. Williams, Professor of Law at the University of California, and she was talking about how the left has lost the working classes. And although she's talking primarily from an American perspective and Grow Social Capital, the co-founders of the festival, felt that it very much resonated with what's been going on in the United Kingdom and potentially other countries in the global north, and we've had some terrific feedback on that since then. Before that, we had the pleasure of the company of Rutger Vilpola, who is originally from New Zealand but now living in the Netherlands, and was talking about sort of socio-spatial analysis, how space shapes and informs how spaces are used by people, how buildings are used based on class, wealth, gender, all sorts of things like that, and bringing her architectural training into that. Fascinating conversation, and looking forward to meeting Rutger in person for the first time in Glasgow at the World Community Development Conference coming up. But we're going to Africa for this episode, and possibly the first time, I think, that we've ever been to Africa. Sadly not in person, but via the internet. It's a welcome to the podcast, and how are you, Daniel Muia?
Thank you. I'm very fine, Russell. It's a pleasure to be back on this podcast series.
We were chatting not so long ago as part of a short series talking about racism, colonialism, anti-discriminatory practice with Anna Clark from the International Association for Community Development. You joined us for that. You're at the University of Kenyatta in Nairobi. It's good to have you back on a podcast, and on this one for the first time. We've been threatening to do this for a while, haven't we?
Sure, and time passes and commitments, but this is a day that now we can talk about it. It's a shame that, again, recently we've just been talking about racism. We should not be an issue and discussion this late, given the milestones that have been made by humanity and all the conventions about human rights that are in place. But nevertheless, here we are. And of course, it's a pleasure to focus also on another issue that is also of equal importance about people living with disability who also suffer situations of injustice and unfairness. So let's see how we go about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So now I'm going to introduce Stellah Masese. Stellah, welcome to the podcast. You're also in Kenya. Looking forward to speaking with you, and thank you to Daniel for putting us in touch with one another.
Thank you, Russell. Thanks for having me in this podcast.
And where in Kenya are you situated?
I'm situated in Nairobi, Kenya.
Okay. And finally, we've also got Boniface Rufo. Welcome to the podcast, Boniface. And again, thank you to Daniel for putting us in touch with one another.
Thank you, Russell, for having me here today. I'm glad to discuss this pertinent issue on people living with a disability. My name is Dr. Boniface. I come from southeast of Kenya. Thank you.
And you're the non-Nairobi-based delegation for this, aren't you? You're in Chuka, yeah?
Yeah, sure.
Boniface, tell me a little bit about your background, your career, and how you found yourself in this thing that we call community development.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Dr. Boniface Munene Rufo. I teach sociology and community development programs in the Department of Social Sciences at Chuka University, Kenya, and I've been teaching since 2019. My first degree is in Bachelor of Science in Community Development from Chuka University. And my second degree, that the master's, is Masters of Arts in Sociology, Rural Sociology and Community Development from University of Nairobi. And my third degree, that the PhD, is a PhD in Sociology. My research interest focuses mostly on social protection and welfare. and more particularly on how communities can co-create, self-reliance pathways rather than relying entirely on government support. So beyond teaching, I actively participate also on community-based inclusive development through outreach programs, and basically I engage my students within and away from the university. The reason I do this is a very important way of connecting theory and theory to practice. So therefore, my journey in academic development, in community development, has largely been shaped by academic study and the practical engagement with communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Boniface. Stellah, what about yourself? What's your background?
My background in community development started in 2010 after I attained my first degree in community development. And then I also have a master's in community development. And then I have a PhD in sociology. Having that background has enabled me to work with different sets of communities, especially the informal settlement, which normally is termed as the slums, where I've been able to work with them for a couple of years, and also have a teaching experience. I've been taught in Kenyatta University and International States University, Africa.
Thanks, Stellah. Daniel, do you want to tell listeners a little bit about your background?
Yes, Russell, and thanks Boniface and Stellah for setting the stage in terms of where you're located as co-workers in the field of community development. Possibly just to indicate, I've been teaching community development for the last several decades, and my training basically originally in sociology with a bias in rural sociology and community development, and of course I've also been now teaching for these many years, both undergraduate and graduate students. I've also been involved in community work, working with communities, community projects, and also I've also been in outreach programs and researching on various topics in community development, basically with a bias towards empowerment processes. Because ultimately the understanding is that communities have a lot of resources and capacities which need to be activated, actualized, so that then they can be able to take charge of the spaces that they find themselves and transform their livelihoods so that they can live in lives of dignity. I've published articles in community development and book chapters, and also edited several books also in the field of community development. And so this gives me a lot of pleasure that I'm able to co-record this podcast with two of my colleagues who have also been part of the group that we have been mentoring in community development.
Thanks, Daniel. And you mentioned book chapters, and I guess that's what we're taking as our sort of leaping off point, if you like, for this episode. There's a book that came out last year, 2025. It's on Palgrave, Macmillan. It's called Community-Based Inclusive Development, an Introduction. And there's a number of chapters in there. And the 13th and the last is by the three of you. And it's entitled When Communities Are Part of the Problem in Community-Based Inclusive Development. And you touched on disability as well in the introduction. Tell us a little bit about, Daniel, about the motivation behind the chapter and what led to you to being part of the book.
Okay, as part of my networks, I got invited to make a contribution in this book, which was being edited by Weber and Grech, who are associated with the CBM, that's a Christian Blind Mission. That's an NGO based in Germany, but with offices and operations in Kenya, and got connected to Weber and Grech by Dominic, who is the lead person on community-based inclusive development at CBM. And of course, we had also met with Dominic under the networking of International Association for Community Development, where he's a member of a committee that I'm involved in, the Professional Development Committee. And part of what they were showcasing is some of the initiatives and new thinking in inclusive community development, where the whole idea was to mainstream issues of people working with people living with disabilities, and trying to connect the theory and the practice. And of course, they had also contributed in an earlier publication that we're working in as part of the World Community Development Conference 2021, where they made the initial the presentation during the conference. And so for this is work that is now being carried forward and being now formalized and put together in one document, which speaks now into how now we can mainstream issues of people with disabilities, providing a new perspective where now it's not just a question of responding to their needs, but also having an holistic and inclusive development. And this, of course, ties in with now my passion in trying to get into processes and the thinking and discourse that empowers communities. And of course, an inclusive community development process where, again, we respond to the needs of the people living with disabilities is one important area that we need to ensure, so that, again, within this ambit of the Sustainable Development Goals, we don't leave anybody behind. And so that's the inspiration that brought me into working with this. And so after being invited, of course, to work on this topic, then, of course, I brought in my colleagues, Boniface and Stellah, as part of just trying to harmonize some of the capacities and strengths that we have to be able to produce a chapter that will respond to the challenge where we are saying communities are supposed to do good all the time, but inadvertently, again, there are processes and issues and structures that, again, can create harm, and we need now to highlight those ones in this chapter. And that's why we are saying communities could also be a source of a problem when we are responding to the needs of people living with disabilities.
And so I don't know if this is a question for Boniface or for Stellah, so I'll leave it to one of the other of you or both to come in. But why the focus on disability then, rather than, I don't know, gender or age, for example?
Disability actually is a strong lens because it reviews, how communities define the normal, the valuable or productive, and also the belonging. So more often you find that persons with disability face exclusion, not only because of their impairment, but because of social barriers, stereotypes, inaccessible systems, stigma, and of course discriminatory cultural meanings, which are already embedded in the African context. So this book chapter, we thought of it because it is an introduction frame in community-based inclusive development as a move away from fixing individuals towards removing the barriers in society. And as my colleague and mentor, Dr. Muia, said, the book chapter also reminds us that communities are not always inclusive. They can also exclude. Of course, they are powerful spaces of care, solidarity, and transformation. But on the other extreme, they also produce stigma, exclusion, and inequality.
Yeah, I could like to add on the same. The focus on disability, from my point of view, more focused on the context of Africa, whereby for the longest time we haven't been able to have a focus on the role of the community and the focus on disability, whereby disability has been there for some time in the communities, but the communities have not been able to have a voice to be able to speak against those different activities that basically lead to exclusion of the different individuals within society. So that now this book provided a forum for us basically to be able to point out our normal activities in society, but now that end up excluding different individuals within our own communities that you want to develop.
Yeah, thanks, Stellah. But I think this is really important, isn't it? Because one of my, and I've mentioned him on this podcast any number of times previously, but one of my significant kind of intellectual inspirations, if you like, is a Welshman called Raymond Williams, who passed away in 1988. and he talks of community as that, quote, warmly persuasive word. It's that word you can kind of put on almost anything, and suddenly it kind of makes it a little bit more benign. It makes it a little bit more, closer to home. It makes it a little bit more positive, a little bit more inclusive, without necessarily actually changing anything fundamentally. And you draw on Robert Putnam's kind of theories of social capital, which is, again, was one of the other reasons for doing this, because that's something I'm a big fan of. Notwithstanding some of Pierre Bourdieu's work on social and cultural capital, but that way in which some communities can be exclusive. They can keep other people out, outsiders out, people who are perhaps not heteronormative in terms of sexuality or in terms of their disability, and so on. So yeah, communities can be difficult. There's a great phrase from an English, I think, sociologist, Stephen Yo, that talks about communities being full of awkward elbows, which I've always quite liked. It's not always positive. It's not always inclusive. It's not easy, and it can sometimes be regressive, can't it, Daniel?
We've indicated, because communities are supposed to be safe spaces, but here we are talking about what is normative, and there's a sense where we can see communities as homogeneous, communities as functional at all times, but for quite some time, until the Convention on the Rights of Persons Living Disability came into place, and we tried now to showcase that statistically we still have about 16% of the population globally living with a disability, and these are population that tends to be hidden in quite many of the cases. A lot of sunshine is not, or light is not shown on them and their needs, which again create a situation where they have more needs which need to be dealt with differently. And of course, there's also these issues of people with disability also are also discussed. There's also, now, as people became a lot more sensitive, there's also the binary view that there are people who are able and people who are disabled, and that's where, of course, failing to realize that we are all able to differently, and we are all capacitated differently, and as human beings, at whatever level we are, we still have a measure of disability one way or the other, and it's a way of now trying to look at how can we be as inclusive as possible, and so that then we can look at the needs of each and everyone at what point they are, and more so when we look at it from the human rights perspective, create a situation where everybody lives in dignity. And those situations in communities then which are difficult to discuss because of stereotypes, or because now, for instance, people with disability don't fit in with the mold of what is normal, then it can be accepted. Still, they have a positive contribution to make, because out of their disability do not make them less human. First and foremost, as human beings, they're human beings, and they have human rights, which are universal entitlements to them. And so disability should not be seen as an abnormality. It's just another way of being abled. And so when then we look at from people living disability from that perspective, then we can now start challenging the community and start opening up and demystifying what is normal in the community, and therefore then find space for all of us, however differently abled we are.
Something that I can add on the same is that everybody in the community is able differently, whereby everybody has a capacity to be able to do something. But now the different social barriers and different exclusions that we put in place as human beings in society are the ones that now create these different limitations, which now lead to the different exclusions for the different individuals that now we have categorized into different social groups in society. That's what I can add.
Something else, also people living with a disability, as Dr. Muia has said, they need to have in mind that they need to have the capacities. For example, they need to go to school and have academic documents, so that as much as you are talking of exclusion, they need to be already empowered. They need to be self-driven. And to me, exclusion of people living with disability is not only on the community level, is not only a community level problem, but it is also produced upstream by organizations and the workplaces. Many organizations, for instance, they hesitate to employ people living with disabilities because they fear legal responsibilities and other costs that come along, including perceived risks at the workplaces.
I think that's important as well, isn't it? These forms of exclusion can then, we talk a lot more these days about intersectionality. They're not fixed, are they? So people with disabilities can face forms of exclusion within, maybe even within the family unit, within their community of locality, in the workplace. How they then engage with state bodies and government bodies and state systems and things like that. So it's layered, isn't it? It's much more nuanced and complex. And the chapter tries to. The book is an introduction to these things. So the chapter covers quite a wide area, draws on lots of different examples from lots of different countries in Africa, and picks some of the nuance that exists there, doesn't it, Daniel?
Yeah, that's part of what we wanted to highlight, because again, when you talk about communities are not homogeneous, because each community has to respond to the demands of the environment in which they are located. And so as we respond then to the challenges of people living with disabilities, we also need to contextualize them within the socio-political environment and socio-cultural environment where they're located, because then the norm, the barriers and the challenges that they have to deal with then are going to be located within those socio-cultural context, in also the socio-political structures that are in place, and equal also the environment both the physical and the natural environment that they are located in. And so as we respond to this, then it's very important that we look at how different communities then speak to issues of disability, because in quite a number of cases, then some of the responses are nuanced, and in other cases, you find people with disability, children born with disability, for instance, then they are labeled as bringing curse or misfortune to the family, and to that extent, they are hidden and excluded and not given a fair chance in life as would be expected. That it's the entitlement in life. In the most recent cases, we've had cases of commodification of disability, where, for instance, we cited cases of Tanzania, where people living disability, especially would be the albinos, their body parts would be harvested, so that then it said that they are going to bring fortune and to other communities, and so their parts become then valuable, and so disability then becomes a commodity that then people can trade in, so to speak, despite the fact that that is going to, of course, to endanger the lives of those people. And equally, when you look at the assistive devices of people living with disability, the cost that is put on them puts a premium on disability across different communities. And so this is the basis upon then we need to look at different communities and what their sociocultural dictates are in terms of then how they respond to people with disability.
And the chapter, I think, certainly from my perspective, as I said, living in the global north, it quite bravely goes into some of these things that I guess on one level, and I think you used the word yourselves in the chapter, amount to sort of superstitions. There's no scientific basis for the belief that, for example, what you've just example you've just described in Tanzania. There's one here I've got in front of me in the chapter in Namibia, a myth that if a pregnant woman sees a child with albinism, she is also likely to give birth to an albino child. And as I said, there's no scientific basis for these things, but the myths, the superstitions, the beliefs of such as this are presumably passed down from generations, but also circulated and reinforced within certain communities. Am I understanding that correctly from my perspective? I don't know if that's maybe for Boniface or for Stellah.
Yeah, you are right, Todd. And one way to explain this is through socialization, because in our book chapter, we have said, we have tried to cover how socialization creates the norm. Because every community manages boundaries. For instance, it defines who is inside and who is outside, who is to be respected, who is to be tolerated. And this aspect of exclusion, to me, has been passed over and over from one generation to the other through socialization. As much as socialization can be viewed on the other side to be very positive, it can also be used to propel exclusion, especially through the myths and stereotypes that Dr. Muia has talked about. And to support his idea on commercialization and commodification, when the communities are part of the problem in this case, we noticed that such practices have led to killings and the disappearance of body parts. And this happens in collaboration between perhaps those in business, I may call them body brokers, and some local community members who should instead be protecting people living with a disability.
Well, just to add on to what Boniface is saying, and also to come back to what you are alluding to from Namibia, the whole aspect that then if, and they believe in the community, of course, there is no scientific basis for the same. If a child, if an expecting woman sees an albino person, they will give birth to the same, then that already is, of course, is a myth. It creates a situation where then those living with albinism, then they have to be hidden. All situations have to create it so that they are not in spaces where then they can be seen, and ultimately that leads to exclusion, and also of course then to them being discriminated in very many situations, and of course they are cast in different light, and ultimately then they are denied their human rights, so to speak. And this is something that, unless it is now brought into place through community education, and of course always also policy programs and legislation, so that then the aspect of albinism is demystified, then of course such disability then continues to be seen in very negative light, and the people in suffering the same, then despite all the capacity that they have to make a contribution to society. And of course, if you don't borrow from the theory of Amartya Sen on the capability approach, we have people with albinism, they have been served in very high offices across the world, but then just because of those myths, then you find such children born with albinism not be given a chance to develop their potential and ultimately be of benefit to society, just because of a myth that can be disabused and can be broken through community education, and of course enforced through sanctions by the state and also by the community.
Yes, I wanted to add on the same, so that as we talk about these cases of disability in our communities, part of what Boniface said about socialization, again, it takes us back to the whole complex of the whole aspect of culture. Within our different cultures, whom have we been able to define as a normal human being? So that from those cultures and the beliefs, now we end up creating our different myth systems, which now lead to these different cases of us viewing the people with disabilities as people who don't fit in our particular communities, so that now we end up either killing these people or selling their different body parts, which again, no scientific basis, but we try to also imagine that their body parts can be able to be a cure for some of the diseases, and some of it also now introduces the whole concept of witchcraft, which again, some of those body parts are used to conduct different witchcraft activities, which is all about our culture. And from these cultures, as we define them and as we create these cultures, then what is it that we put together that is able to define us? And as it's defining us, is it able to include everyone? Or there's now different barriers that now we are creating within the societies, which now ultimately now lead to all these different commercial activities that are targeted on people living with disability.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, to what extent, and this is again my global northness on show, I don't know, but to what extent is there a danger that in confronting some of these issues, you talk, Daniel, about the importance of community-based education and maybe community development workers being, involved with the delivery of that. To what extent is there a danger that, modernity, as we might describe some of this sort of approach, also has some unintended consequences around other forms of community organising, community forms of socialisation, structures within communities, all those sorts of things?
What basically we are alluding to is that as we start now challenging the status quo in terms of what is socio-culturally the norm, of course it means then you are trying to bring change in society. And when of course you start now bringing change to society, of course you start threatening the status quo, some of the knowledge systems, some of the value systems, some of the sanctions. All these have been with us for a very long period of time. And so when we start now challenging this, of course, then we are challenging what is popular and what has been commonly understood. And that means then as you now start challenging that, the status quo, then of course you have also to get into a point where people have to start looking at what you are saying, okay, might make sense from a scientific perspective, but then they are telling you this is what has happened, this is what we have been living with for a very long period of time. And so in terms of trying now to bring this change, a new way of thinking and appreciating that, for instance, disability, it can be, issues of inclusion need to be mainstreamed, then of course it becomes challenging, and ultimately then finding space at the policy level, at the practice level, and also at the community level, then it becomes still quite a big ask, because then you have to really engage with the community leaders, so to speak, first, so that they can be convinced that things can be looked at differently, and more so where in some cases then disability is viewed in very adverse ways. Then simply you are being told you are bringing cars to the community, you are encouraging cars to families, and you are bringing misfortune to the community, and that's not a safe space to be in. And so it's a process where people need to engage in a very structured manner, so that then as we challenge the social cultural position, then it is done with the understanding that there's going to be resistance, and of course it also poses some risk for the individual actors, both at the state and non-state level.
Maybe something small I can add. We have talked about the binary conceptualization of disability, where disability is looked at through the social model perspective and also the medical model perspective. Let me say that even the most educated people, for example in Africa, they also fall into the trap of stereotyping and all these kind of the myths. So change is inevitable, and to me, we should not just look at the community in terms of the local community and think that they are the ones perpetuating this. Even the most educated people, actually, you'll be shocked that they are part of the human trafficking, where they target people living with, let's say, albinism and other forms of disability. And a lot is going on. So when we talk of changing all this, let's target all people in all levels.
What I can also add here, as Dr. Muia is mentioning that the aspect of community education, I think the key word here is the concept change. We as the community members, have we been able to reach a point where we can be able to accept change? Which again now calls for everybody in the society, from the people creating policy to the implementers and to us, the community, and even to that specific household, that as a person with a disability, have we been able to reach a point where we can be able to accept the change? So that again, if we talk about disability and we put it in the context of, especially in Africa, it's a topic that people are not willing to talk about. It's a scenario whereby people don't want to expose the people that they have that have any form of disability, so that is something that we have more or less covered with a blanket and we don't want to discuss about it. So even as we introduce this community education, then how can you be able to prepare this community in ways that we can be able now to talk to them about the concept of disability, which again, there are different members of our society with different vested interests. We have our different traditions again, which dictate the different ways that we should be able to behave and what we should be able to engage in. So this concept of change then how best can we be able to package it, which now is what you have been trying to look at in terms of the different ways that community is creating challenges, which now these challenges can be able to give us more or less a focus on what we should look at when we talk about communities with the concept of disability. Talk about their myths, talk about their stereotypes, talk about their concept of even culture, talk about even the literacy levels in the community. All this, if they can be packaged together and we try to look for possible solutions, then we can be able to create the different inclusions for the different individuals in society.
And I suppose that there where you said there is around doing it through a form of dialogue, and it's doing it through deliberation, and it's maybe taking our time with these things with communities. That's where the community development bit comes in, rather than a state, a very, very blunt, one-size-fits-all state approach that maybe just sort of says, right, we will outlaw this, we will make illegal these sorts of actions, and that's it. Sitting down with people for them to then inculcate some of those new beliefs, those altered, revised beliefs, internally, to then allow those to be socialised. That's the slow, deliberative approach that the community development takes. And I think as well, not for one moment do I think that there's those of us in the global north or outside of Africa are immune to these forms of received wisdoms. They may not be superstitious perhaps in origin, but there's very much embedded in countries like mine and economies like mine, concepts such as the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, that people are at fault for the conditions that they find themselves, or for the poverty that they're experiencing. And these things are very, very deeply embedded into how forms of policy, benefit, welfare systems operate. So the notion that maybe it's only continents like Africa or countries like Tanzania, Namibia, Kenya, and so on have these sorts of deeply ingrained beliefs, I think would be deeply arrogant on the part of people in parts of the world where I live, for example.
Just to pick up from where you've stopped, the whole aspect and the whole basis of community-based inclusive development is to appreciate just what you've said, because as resources become limited, then there is a sense in which you need to look at how can we respond to the needs of people with disabilities and mainstream response to their needs, so that ultimately we can create equal and in some cases equitable access to opportunities and resources, because given their state of disability and therefore in some cases inability, they easily get edged out when there is competition for resources and opportunities. And so when then we don't become holistic and also purposive and deliberate in allocating resources and pulling everybody on board and being inclusive, then very easily the rights and also interests of people living disability get marginalized in the competition for the limited resources.
And of course, resources always something we've got to bear in mind. It's not limitless, of course. Could you point to examples, I don't know whether it may be a question for Boniface or for Stellah, can you point to examples where some of this education work has taken place with a degree of success within communities that were still holding these forms of belief and superstition in a way that then can be used to not only inform other practice, but can almost point to other communities, well, here's where these changes have happened and that they've been progressive in their outcome?
Yeah, sure. These changes are evident within the same communities that we are in, and what is happening is through government and through different organizations, including community-based organizations, they are trying to change the narrative from the sympathy and the charity model, because all along people living with a disability have been looked at in a very sympathetic way, if I may say, and therefore models have been developed in terms of being charity giving and charity inclined in terms of resource mobilization. So these narratives are being changed to opportunity and the symbiotic models, including changing even special schools to integrated models of schools. And this is happening especially in Kenya, where you could see some schools were purposely meant for, let's say, the blind. Now that narrative, the moment you isolate a school and say this only belongs to the blind, I mean, to me, that's where exclusion starts. So it is slowly changing, and these children are already included. When you visit some of these schools in Kenya, you see those children also. Of course, they are given special attention, but they're also learning with other children.
Yeah.
Just to add to what Boniface is talked about in education, where now the move is now to have an inclusive education system, where now children living with disability do not have to be taught separately. Where possible, they are integrated and they are part of the mainstream education, of course. And then the teachers are trained to be responsive to the needs of the children living with disability. And that in itself, of course, demystifies their position, because then once they learn with the children who are differently abled, then it becomes a lot more easier now to appreciate where each category of the children are. Those who are more needs because they are living a disability, of course, then the rest of the children are able to see that these are also our colleagues. And even them, when now there is a whole list of competition in terms of performance, they start seeing even the children who are living with a form of disability or the other, they are just performing as well as them, or in some cases even better. And that demystifies the fact that despite the disabilities, they still can make a contribution, so to speak. What I want to indicate is out of now all this education and sensitization that is in place, when it comes now to policy and practice, including legislation, there is a sense in which in quite many countries now, affirmative action becomes the norm. And where you find now, if, for instance, in elective offices, there is a push also to have people with disability also given an opportunity and a head start. When it comes to appointments, there is a requirement that affirmative action also is given to people living with disability. And actually a quota system is it put in place so that then the people living disability then can be given a head start. For instance, when it comes now to appointments, if there is competition between a person with a disability and a person who has no disability within the Kenyan context, the person with disability gets a head start and gets affirmative consideration. And that in itself is out of all the campaigning and all the education that has come through, so that then the considerations and the needs and the rights of the people with disability then can be taken on board and mainstreamed.
There's a great point from Boniface about the the role of schooling in all of this and bringing people together, particularly at a young age, because I guess, if attitudes can be inculcated amongst children at a young age, then they're more likely to take them into adulthood, I guess. Might be simplifying things there a little bit, but I think there's something in that. I suppose it's worth pointing out as well that, disabilities aren't necessarily something that people are born with. They can be acquired through illness, through conflict, through serving in the military, through accidents on the road or in the workplace. So again, there's a social aspect to how disabilities are acquired as well, and some communities and some countries are more riven with conflict, sadly, than others, and often those are over competitions for resources. To come back to your point about resource, Daniel, just to sort of begin to sort of wrap some of this up, Stellah, I mean, was there a hope behind the chapter that it would further these sorts of conversations or stimulate greater governmental input into some of these issues and an increase in the allocation of resources, for example?
Yes, there is hope, simply because these communities and all these challenges, then how do we rope in the government in terms of policy? And the policy from a point of, yes, the policies have been created, but how do we get them fully implemented in the communities so that now we can be able to include these groups, especially in the point of education? For instance, in Kenya, we have free primary education, which was started way back in 2003. But if today we were to evaluate, is this education able to have an impact in our different communities in terms of now including people with disabilities? Whereby, yes, the policy is there, all children need to go to school. Now, these communities, have they been able to take these children to school? And also the government as the main actor in the whole concept of making sure that children are able to go to school and access education, as the government been able to set up these schools that can be able to accommodate these different sets of children who have the different disabilities, which basically now is all about the different ways of trying to make sure that education is accessible and these children being given a space basically to get access to education, whereby now as they get this access to education, then now they can be included to the different mainstream activities within the different societies.
And not just governmental, as in sort of state, national boundaries. I mean, there's a lot of reference to the role, as there often is with community development discussions and things, is the role of supranational and global organisations such as the United Nations, of course. So yeah, it's at lots of different levels as well. But Boniface, a final point from you.
Let me talk about the importance of data as far as people living with a disability concerned, because basically this helps the government, organizations, and even the community themselves to understand the need of persons living with disability, and of course also to plan for appropriate services, to allocate resources fairly, and monitor progress towards inclusion. So without reliable data, many persons living with a disability remain invisible in the policies and the development programs. And the key data that should be collected include, for example, the type and severity of disability, the age, gender, let's say education level, employment status, assistive devices, and of course participation, the level of participation of persons with disability in the community activities. For example, the data showing that many children with the visual impairments are not attending school can guide the government to have inclusive education. And similarly as well, when we talk of employment data, it can reveal also barriers that prevent persons with a disability from accessing decent work opportunities. So, because the disability information is personal and sensitive, to me, I feel that it should be stored securely in, for example, password-protected databases with restricted access. And for example, in Kenya, I have not really seen, we usually do census, and I have not seen a very special census meant for persons living with disability. So this means that the data that we collect through the government and the organizations, it needs to be protected. Personal identifiers also should be protected. And data should only be shared with authorized individuals and for legitimate purposes. Because again, we have seen briefcase organizations getting the data for persons with a disability, and they use them for their own gain. Data should also be regularly backed up and archived in secure digital repositories to ensure long-term preservation and the future use for research and the policy formulation. So, in conclusion, it is very critical for persons living, for data to be there for easier monitoring and evaluation of persons living with disabilities, including follow-up from maybe even hospitals, among other institutions. So proper collection, storage, and use of disability data support evidence-based decision-making and help to promote the rights, inclusion, and well-being of persons with disability. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Community Development Podcast. And to support the podcast and help it share learning, connect the workforce, and raise the profile and the merits of community development approaches, why not become a Patreon at patreon.com/the CD podcast.